So what I did is, as I started to look at the varieties, for those of you that are following peppers, the newest thing in peppers are the X10 peppers. And that's the peppers with the resistance to all 10 strains of the bacterial leaf spot. Now you might say, well, Tim, why did you put them in a tunnel? Because basically when you're dealing with bacteria, the main problem with that is it tends to splash around. But part of what I wanted to look at is, okay, so they have X10. If there's still a better pepper to put in the tunnel, if they've got something that's going to, in terms of yield, better color, better anything, then we can still grow them in a tunnel. And then if as a grower you'd want to put some inside to leave them go to color and some outside. So there will be some X10 varieties in here, although there are some other new varieties as well. So there were 34 varieties overall. There were actually 8 of them that are the X10 peppers, and then I collected some that we had looked at before in the tunnel along with new varieties. We used the plastic culture system there in the tunnel. It was narrow rows. They were 18-inch spacing between them. It was a staggered double row. So we go ahead and have the plants are 18 inches between, and then we stagger them offset. 3 4-plant replications, standard fertility, and I'm also have in there that I used biocontrol, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I'm trying to reduce the number of sprays in there. Seeded them on April the 6th. Got them in the tunnel later than I would have liked ideally. I'm going to try and push that back this year a little bit. We got them in mid-May last year, which really you lose some of that earliness advantage and overall probably total yields on that. And we harvested them weekly. They were graded into number 1s, number 2s, and culls. They were all counted and weighed. So I'm just going to mention biocontrol, and this gets a little lost here in the trial or in the slides. But I had been doing some work looking at this, and one of the things, as Steve mentioned earlier, when you're in a tunnel, or even in the field for that matter, you know, a lot of times if you're in harvest, what do you spray? How do you manage pests? And in a tunnel, if you're thinking about biocontrol at all, and you're either in a greenhouse or a high tunnel, I encourage you to look into it. It's much easier. The system works better in an indoor environment. We're still trying to figure it out outside. But I had seen some of this work out of the University of New Hampshire, and basically on the left here, you know, they had some habitat plants, and we'll come back to that, but they were looking at the diversity, and all these different colors were different biocontrol insects. We're just looking at insects here, and then these are the different plants, and you can see in this particular trial they had different plants. So I went ahead and I mimicked that. You had borage, we had dill. I actually planted something called Amimagus, which is related to both the dill, but more of a Queen Anne's lace, marigolds, alyssum, and the idea being that you're providing nectar sources, or in some cases actually a refuge to go ahead and keep, the marigolds were in there to keep spider mites around, and I actually planted some green beans so that if on the offhand chance the biocontrols eliminated all the mites, the beans were there, they liked the beans. And it actually worked well for me. What I observed this year is that the alyssum always had something on it. So if you're even thinking about it, if you're kind of on the edge, I would definitely get alyssum in there. It bloomed all season. There were always insects there. Also the Amimagus was another one. It's a flat top plant. You're probably all familiar with Queen Anne's lace. The Amimagus stayed much smaller. It was easier to manage versus the dill. Sometimes you'll see dill. Well, the dill got very tall and fell over. So I would encourage you to go ahead and look at that. The alyssum we didn't need to do anything with. The Amimagus you need to keep pulling the seed heads off so it keeps flowering. But it flowered throughout the season. And the marigolds and beans, I had put them in there. They got covered up with mites. I released my predators. Everything disappeared. So it was just a really interesting system for me. What did I see in there? Well, the predators I was releasing basically were not worm predators. So I did see some worm pressure in there. As Steve had mentioned earlier, you need to watch what you would put in there. We actually used Coragen, and I think we messed up our system. And from when I'm going to do it this year, I'm going to look toward the BT type products. Later in the year, aphids appeared. And if you're familiar with the biocontrol system, the food needs to be there before the predator is. And if you watch your crops in the spring, you'll see the aphids before you see the ladybird beetles. And the reverse happens in the fall. The predators stopped reproducing because of the day length and the temperatures. The aphids were fine, so we had some aphid problems in the fall. So just be aware of, again, if you're using this system, if you're carrying the system longer, you might need to look at some kind of a non-biological spray. And again, in the fall they're not reproducing. But the softer materials are available to do that. I'll just say as we got into the fall and you've got bigger plants, the coverage becomes more important. So it's kind of a trade-off, but certainly I would encourage you folks, and peppers are an easy place to start. Tomatoes are a bit more challenging. Again, Steve had mentioned about the trichromes and that sap on there, and a lot of the predators don't like that, but peppers are a good place to start. One of the things I was really after was the broad mites. We've been having broad mite problems on the research farm. I know I've been working with some growers in the counties around, and I keep hearing about broad mites. And if you've got any relationship, if you're producing, it seems like any kind of bedding plants, I still point my finger at the bedding plants, although we think they can overwinter. But we have the flower trial at the research farm. There's over 1,000 varieties or bedding plants. I'm still going to point my finger at that and say they're there. But they showed up in my tunnel, and they actually got in there before the flowers opened. And I point that out because the predator I was using, the Phaceolus, can feed on pollen. And Steve had mentioned growing the black pearl pepper if you're growing tomatoes. Well, in a pepper tunnel, once your flowers start, the Phaceolus can feed on the pepper pollen if there aren't insects there. And the mites actually showed up in my tunnel before the peppers were flowering, so I had to use a couple of sprays. I actually used Portal in there. This year I'm going to look into actually releasing the predators earlier, going ahead and using, they can sell you pollen to go ahead and feed them. I'm going to see if I can do totally spray-free next year. But again, they were early in there. Once I released the predators, I controlled them. I didn't see broad mites again until the end of the season when the predators start to go down. But this isn't a predator talk, but I just wanted to put that in there that I think it's a really workable system. And I was walking through the tunnels and the lacewings were just flying around me, so it was really interesting. But here's how I'm going to present my data. I'm going to start with the red pepper. These numbers are per plant. So I went ahead, so if you had grown peppers before, you can think back to what's your plant spacing. I put Charisma on the top because this was one of the better varieties from our earlier work. So I always like to have a standard and compare it to it. Was it better or worse? So what this number is here, so my plants for Charisma averaged 4.5 number 1 peppers that weighed a little over 3 pounds, 3.2, almost 2 number 2 peppers at 1.2. When you see a little star after some of these varieties, those are the X10 varieties that are in there, and I collected them from a bunch of different sources. And one of the things that I had heard about the X10s, there's 2 problems with X10s. As it gets cold, some of the varieties flatten out, and the other is that there's a yield drag. And we'll see some yield drag. You can look here at, the Green Flash didn't do too bad overall, but we'll see here, look at the Mariner, really low numbers. So one size doesn't fit all, and I saw the same thing in the field, but one that surprised me here was the Antebellum. You can see here it was the same weight of number 1s as the Charisma. So it actually did well. Same relative number 2s I put in there. We don't want number 2s as growers, so I don't like to see something here where the Cherokee had a large number of number 2s. I don't like to see that as growers. That takes the value down. You can still sell them, but you get less money for that as well. So in this first one, the Charisma and the Antebellum were good varieties. Mercer's another new red variety that I hadn't seen before. We'll see some pictures later on, a nice attractive pepper. But the one that did the best in the trial was Ninja, which actually is an X10 pepper, which surprised me, but it did very well. You can see here almost 4 pounds per plant compared to the 3.2 for the Charisma. And ProCraft was another one that had almost 3 pounds. That was a new variety I hadn't seen before. And yields were similar. Some of the newer ones here, this one wasn't happy in the tunnel, just the nature of the variety, so that's partly why I like to do this work. So then as recommendations can go out to you folks as growers. And then the final group here, I want to point out Red Knight is the other standard, and I go back and forth whether or not to use that one as a standard. I just put Charisma up there this year because that was the one that had done better, but actually the Red Knight was actually second in terms of 3.6 pounds. It did well. I'm guessing most of you that would grow red colored peppers in a tunnel probably familiar with Red Knight. It's a little bit on the smaller side, but still acceptable. It's over 1/2 pound. To me, the cutoff is about 1/2 pound, and we'll see weight in a moment. Samurai was another one of the X10s that was pretty good in there. Sprinter, over 3 pounds per plant. So I was impressed with some of what's out there, and you can see Red Knight, even though it had a higher number of number 2s, Touchdown had a lot more number 2s than I would have liked to have seen there. Going back to this next chart, then you've got total marketable weight, so this is the 1s and 2s, and then I did average fruit size. And in this first group here, again, you can see the Majestic Red was a little smaller, but that wouldn't really be an issue. I think the half-pound mark is what's critical. So these are all good-sized peppers. The other one I look at, what's the percent marketable? And you can see here, the Majestic Red and the Mariner a little bit down. I didn't present the cull numbers in here, but basically what that's saying is more of the yield that would have been in there. If you look, at the numbers of total harvested weight, more of that was actually cull. And this year I was seeing two things. When the caterpillars got in there on me for a while, I lost some yield to the caterpillars, but the other is shape. Some of these peppers just were more misshapen or didn't grade out as well. So that's some of what you're seeing here. But overall, pretty good yields on that first group. Looking at the second group, again, pretty good pack outs here in terms of the fruit size. This the PS variety here, the 1819 is the one we commonly grow in the field for those large green peppers. And you can see it had good sized red peppers. It was the largest pepper here in the trial at 0.76. A little bit lower in terms of the pack out. The total yields were good, but we had more number 2s and culls in that particular variety. Here's the Ninja with almost 80% pack out. Mercer was another good variety. I like that one, 81% pack out. So there's some really nice red varieties there. And then the final group, here's the Red Knight. You can see the smallest in there, but really it actually was a little bit bigger than what I had before. Sprinter, the fruit's getting a little bit small. It was a really nice red, attractive fruit. We'll look at it again for another year, but just getting a little bit small depending on your market. I think we've got other varieties here that have good size that maybe we'll have to watch and see on that one. That one is actually a true greenhouse variety, and the true greenhouse varieties tend to be a little bit smaller in my experience. So these are the red varieties. Moving on to the orange varieties, and the first thing that you're going to see is the yields generally were good here. Again, I just kept Charisma in there kind of as the red standard, and you can see there were plenty of varieties here. The Delirio, Milena, Moscato, and Orange had good yields. They were above 3 pounds per plant. First thing you notice, a lot more fruit here in the number 1s, and we're going to see in a moment that translates into smaller fruit, which is what we've seen in the past. But overall, good yields on the orange varieties. But you can see smaller fruit. Now, Garfield had slightly larger fruit in this. The total marketable weight was down, larger fruit. You can see everything else was below the half pound. So in the orange fruit market, your customers are probably not used to really big orange fruit. What we've had in the past, again, we often Delirio and Milena are kind of the standards. So we're not there yet. With the yields down here in the Garfield slightly less, I still wouldn't necessarily say I would go to that just yet. Moving on to the yellow fruit, and this is more of a mix. There are some larger fruited yellow. In the past we had Lafayette, one that I had in there that we'll see in a moment is the Sirius. But again, in terms of the numbers, now here's Galleon. This is actually an X10 that turns yellow at maturity, and that had a real yield drag on it. Dazzle has a couple stars. I got a bad batch of seed on that, so I only had 1 rep. So this one isn't as many plants. This is actually numbers from 4 plants. So I'm going to look at that again this year. But you can see, again, Catriona, which is one we've seen in the past, is still up at the top of the pile, as I like to say. Sirius, which was one I hadn't looked at before, looked good. A bay, if you're a field grower that goes to yellow. I had a grower that said this is his favorite field yellow pepper. In the tunnel, it was down a little bit. I would still say the Catriona, possibly the Sirius, were a little bit better there. You can see the fruit size was overall good. Even the Abbé was a better one. Catriona, again, the problem there, your fruit gets a little bit smaller. Probably not totally as much of an issue with the yellows necessarily because they're not quite as small. But again, it would depend. If you had a nice Sirius alongside of that, possibly then we know sometimes the customers just like those big yellow peppers. And the Abbé had a better size there, but overall the total marketable yield was a little lower. Here's the Catriona. The Dazzle looked good, and the Sirius looked good, again, with good fruit size. The Galleon had good fruit size, but I had mentioned it was just a real yield drag on that one. So I wouldn't think that would be one that I would start out recommending that you go look at. Early Sensation was another one I hadn't looked at before, had good fruit size. Flavor Burst is one that was our second highest yielder in the past. This year it just really didn't do well, but that's an interesting pepper. So let's look at some pictures. So starting out with Charisma. And one of the things, it had good yield, but you can see it's got a nice bright red color. It's got that blocky shape. And I really tried not to pick out all of the best peppers. It's always fun to make the pictures. Am I making the catalog picture to sell this, or am I making the picture to let you folks as growers know? So I tried to just reach in the basket and get what were representative peppers. And you can see, sometimes we don't like the 3-lobe peppers. But I think in the color market, it's not quite as hard on that. I know when we get in the green market, we really like those blocky 4-lobe green peppers. But I don't quite think that we're quite as hard on that. To me, I think we look at color and uniformity. So Charisma, one of the things I was noticing is some of these newer varieties are really dark red. And here's the Antebellum. It was an attractive pepper, a little bit rougher in terms of the shape, but dark red all the way through there. Certainly folks that are cutting this and mixing this in like a stir fry, it's just a really attractive, I think that red would stand out in a salad, if you will. This one did tend to be more of the true blocky type pepper, which they would again be looking at this for a field situation. Here's Boca again, and one of the things we saw a lot this year was some of this secondary growth in there. And I'm not quite sure what causes that. We seem to have seen a little bit more. I see your head shaking. Did you see more this year? And I'm not sure. Have you figured out what causes that?
The weather was a challenge this year. I think it could be physiological.
It has to be physiological, I'm guessing. But why I'm pointing that out is when you look at, any one or all 3 of these peppers could have that inside, you really don't see anything from the outside until you cut the pepper. I'm guessing, though, since when we would cut the pepper that the homeowner would look at that and then they just would pop that out because that's not part of the pepper that you're eating anyway. But again, this was the Boca pepper, and I've probably, up here on the top, I just put the company that supplied it, by the way. So this one had come from Seedway. I had gotten this from Sakata, the Cherokee. Again, this was a nice pepper. I liked it, just the yields weren't there, but it had good color. It was a nice blocky pepper, not quite as rough as some of the other ones. This was one out of a company called Clifton Seed. They're down in South Carolina. And again, this was one of the ones that they had in there. Overall, okay, but just getting a little more of a different shape to it. Another one from Clifton was Green Flash. This is one of the X10s. A little bit more variability in terms of the size of the peppers. The red didn't always come in quite as even as I would have liked to have seen there. Majestic Red was one from Twilly. Had really nice color on it. Again, having that nice red all the way through the flesh. The yields were okay on that one. Mariner, another X10 variety, and this one kind of the yields were down on this, and this is getting what I would call a little bit rougher. So you look at that and the shapes, you've got the deeper sutures in there. That's not necessarily what we're looking for. A few more of the 3-lobed peppers in there. Here's one Mercer. And this one was one of the ones that I liked. Again, good color with that, fairly uniform, a nice smooth fruit. Mingan was a larger fruit. You can see how I had to kind of squeeze that one in there. Again, a little bit blotchy in terms of the ripening, so these you might need to hold, a little bit rougher in terms of the shape. Little thinner walls, which maybe we're not quite as critical about as we are in the green peppers, but certainly if we can start to be picky, we can start to look at the thickness of the walls, and that might be something I'll go ahead and add to my measurements this year. Ninja. Again, this was a surprise for me, but you look at this now, it had a good even size. It has that nice bright red color in there. I had planted this in the field, and it didn't do nearly as well in the field. This one's happier in a tunnel. Whether or not the seed cost would balance out, I don't know just yet. I'll have to go back and look at that, but I'll be really curious to follow that one this year. Here's one pepper number 1 from Clifton Seed. Again, a little more variability in the size, but it was just interesting as I was cutting them. A lot more just have that really dark red all the way through was something that surprised me. Procraft, a little bit more, kind of variation there, but overall it's a smooth pepper with good color in there. Peto Seed 1819, and again, this is kind of our large field standard, or one of them. We had put it in the tunnel before. This one's yields were down a little bit this year again because more of them were either number 2s or graded out as to culls. It just didn't do as well in the tunnel. So a little bit again of that green in there, but overall you've got a nice blocky pepper if that's important for your market. Here's another one from Pito Seed, the 8302. The yields weren't great on this one, a little bit rougher in terms of the appearance. 9325. Which is kind of becoming the standard X10 variety over in New Jersey where they're having issues. So I looked at this one again, really dark red color, but to me that's getting to be kind of a rough fruit. And when we move into this specialty market, if you will, of color peppers, I think it becomes more important that we have a nice, smooth pepper that's not quite, with all these different nooks and valleys in there. This isn't an English muffin. We have peppers. But the color was good. But here's Red Knight, which probably is our early standard. But again, one of the things to notice, the color, there's a bright red, but it just doesn't have that real dark in there. And again, a little bit more variability in there, but certainly one of the earliest varieties. Here's Samurai. This is the other X10 from Sakata Seed that I had this year. This one actually did better in the field, and they flip-flopped in the tunnel. So it was interesting to see. A little bit rougher in terms of appearance, the shape wasn't as nice as the Ninja. Sprinter, again, really nice red color, nice bright red. It wasn't that real dark, but a little more uniform in terms of the size. This one was just over my magic line of a ½ pound in terms of size, but the yields were good. Here's another one, an SV 3265, another X10 variety. The yields were down. The appearance of the fruit was nice blocky pepper, good red color, just the yield wasn't quite there. And Touchdown is a newer one that, if you follow peppers, it's got really big over in New Jersey, but just a really rough fruit. So certainly not something I would look at in a tunnel. And Trilogy, a little bit of blotchy ripening on that one, good color on the inside, a little unevenness in terms of the appearance of the fruit. Moving on to the orange, Delirio, which is probably our standard orange, or one of the oranges that we've talked about before. And again, you can see smaller fruit. I've noticed you'll see a lot more of the 3-lobed fruit as we get into the colored fruit. Garfield was one from Twilly Seed, I hadn't seen before. A little bit rough in terms of the shape, but not a bad fruit. It had good color. The yields weren't too bad on that one. Milena was what I would call our other current standard in terms of oranges. Again, not totally as even. I don't think it's as nice of a package as the Delirio, but good yields. This was one I went back and looked through all my pictures, and that's supposed to be an orange. I'm kind of calling that a yellow. I have to go back and see because I have the right label on there. I don't know if I didn't leave it on long enough, and the reason I say that is because when you get to the Flavor Burst, which I don't have yet, Flavor Burst goes yellow, and then if you leave it long enough, it goes orange to red. And I'm wondering if this Moscato, we need to leave it on there a little longer, so I'll go back and look at that. But it's a nice blocky pepper, getting a little bit rough, but it tended to be nice 4-lobe pepper. An Orangi is another one that had nice orange color, a little bit of variability in the size, but I don't think that was too bad. The yields weren't quite up there with the Delirio and the Milena, but again, we'll see what happens in the second year. Moving on to the yellows, Abay, which is a new yellow pepper out there. And again, fairly nice pepper, good size, thinner walls, but overall okay. Catriona, which is one that was one of our better yellows in the past trials, still came out on top again this year. Again, a little bit rough in terms of the appearance, but it's a 4-lobe pepper, and we're not quite as picky with that. Dazzle was one that looked good from that small planting that I had. I'll be curious again to get a better look at it this coming year. Early Sensation, and started to even see some 5-lobed peppers. Sometimes these bigger ones end up being a 5-lobed pepper. A little bit of variation in terms of the size here. But here's Flavor Burst, and this one actually starts out growing a lighter yellow-green color. It goes to the yellow, and if you leave it long enough, it becomes orange and red. So this is one, depending on the color that you want for your market. It tends to be a longer pepper with a thin wall and almost more 3 lobes than 4. In the past, it had yielded better than it did this year, so I'm not sure why that was down, but that one had looked good. Galleon, which was the X10, and just a rather uneven appearance here, kind of a rough fruit, wasn't good yield. And Sirius, some variation in the size, so when you see that 0.6 pound, that doesn't mean all of them were big. You're going to see some variation there. And again, a thinner walled pepper, but overall it was a smooth pepper, tended to be blockier, and was a nicer pepper overall. So with that, I got us back on time, but I'll certainly take any questions you might have. If anyone has some questions. Yes, ma'am. I did not plan any purples in there. There's the reality of the size of my tunnel and my labor force, and I balance them out. I figure there aren't that many purple varieties overall, and when I get to those, because there's chocolate peppers too, I figure if you're growing those, you're probably experimenting on your farm. So I didn't look at those. Yes, sir.
I guess maybe, I don't want to go outside of what you test, but like Orange Blaze for high tunnel seems to really come early for orange pepper. It may not fit the characteristics. It's probably less than half a pound. But,
And part of it is trying to limit this to a realistic number. If I remember, Orange Blaze is an older variety.
it's been around.
It's been around for a while, so maybe I should go ahead and, it sounds like it's working well for you, so maybe I need to dig it up.
The other question is, you know, you stick to size, but I like the Cute Stuff series. Now they're like
They're a really small pepper, the mini peppers.
not really, I mean,
Well, but they're
third size,
I know what you're talking, and
quarter pound.
and we could do all kinds of pepper tests. So I kind of basically I try and stay with the standard blocky bell peppers. So, but certainly there are many more colored peppers. There's some really small ones, the Cutie series, and there's several other ones where you get these small peppers. To compare apples to apples, I just tried to stay with what would be a standard bell pepper. Other questions? Don't see anything from the far reaches. Over on this side. Yes, sir.
Sometimes your seed cavities look like they have mold on them. What causes
Good observation. One of the things that I noticed this year, and I don't know if you saw this as well, they didn't close as well. On the ones that had that mold in there, if I looked where the flower was, often there was a very tiny opening. And I saw a lot more of that. When I would cut one and see that color, I would flip it back and look, and 9 times out of 10, that pepper had not fully sealed. And
weather conditions?
well, and I don't know if that goes back to, we were talking weather or possibly as what was causing that deformation, and that's an interesting question. I don't have the answer for you that. I had seen some of that before, but it seemed like it was worse this year. So I'm going to go back and try and see if there's more of a relation with that and maybe look at the varieties a little closer. I don't know, Deb, if I put you on the spot, did you notice anything on the field side, or is it more of an indoor issue?
I think it happens outside too.
It does happen outside as well. And the problem with the colored bells in general or anything, the longer you leave it on the plant, it seems like there's more things that can go wrong with that. But again, the ones when I consistently, 9 times out of 10, if I flipped it back when I saw that in there, the opening hadn't sealed, and maybe that would be something I need to look at in terms of grading those out because of that potentially being in there. Because unlike that green stuff that a homeowner will pry out, mold is not going to go in the salad.
Yeah, I had noticed that in some of the hot pepper varieties they had it, and my production is all outside, by the way. But it seemed to me that the earlier fruit tended to have it a little bit more. Later it went away for me.
Okay, I'll have to pay more attention to that as well.
Wet June.
Well, we did have a wet spring, but I'm trying to think when I didn't start harvesting in here until July because I got them in later. So and again, but it could have gotten in as that pepper was forming if that mold spore got in there. Certainly but the environment inside a pepper is easily going to stay much more humid than it would outside. But in general, in a tunnel, you tend to have a more humid environment. This one, because you roll the sides down when it's cool and you go in there in the morning and there's just the moisture everywhere. So that probably would aggravate it some.
What's the best thing to trigger the color?
The best thing to trigger the color?
Usually if it has a spot on it, it turns red really fast. But
Well, in terms of the pepper, it's going to be a maturity of the pepper, as well as then when you say if it's got a spot on it, it's actually an ethylene. So when the pepper's maturing, you've got that ethylene is a harvest or a hormone. It's a ripening hormone. So a damage, and I know what you're saying, sometimes where I see where the worms chewed, it would get color around that area first. So that's a response to the damage.
so you could spray them with ethylene in a high tunnel and they will turn red.
I don't know that anyone's ever done that. It would be an interesting study, but basically, though, for that pepper, you want to leave it get fully mature anyway to get the best weight on it. So, how are you going to know when to go in there with the ethylene? The other thing that would be a problem potentially would be ethylene tends to knock flowers off. So, I'm not quite sure that would be a good option.
I have two questions.
Yes, Deb.
Did you see any cracking or like russeting on the red peppers?
First question, all right, I guess I should have been repeating questions. Did I see any russeting? I did see a little bit, but not a lot.
Because I figured they would be better in a high tunnel than in the field, but you do see more problems in the field.
In the field. Well, and I think that also goes back to, and the idea behind getting the peppers in the tunnel is you keep the water off them. And the first year, or one of the early years when Steve and I did this, we put a comparable planting in the field, and we were packing out maybe 50% from the field planting because of cracking and insect damage. It was just, I don't know how anyone really makes a good living in a wet year with colored peppers in the field. So you had.
My other question is, I'm really worried about broad mites because they were so bad last year. Does the trap crop without the insects would not work, or would it work?
Okay, so the question is that, we're hearing more about broad mites. I don't know if it's just with Pennsylvania or not. New York has some. So her question was, would the trap crop work without the release? And I'm going to say no, because you need to have those insects disperse in there. So if there's down here and you've got a 100-foot tunnel, unless you have something all along, plus I don't know that Phaceolus is an endemic insect that would come in. So we actually did an inundative release, and then I hung the sachets on each plant in there to go ahead and get that population up after we got them under control. So I don't think it would be a natural control situation without release.
Would it actually be bad, do you think?
Bad?
To have the alyssum in there, would it actually draw?
I don't think it's going to draw them in, because they're feeding on the plants themselves. They're not feeding on the alyssum. The alyssum is a nectar source for the beneficial adults. It's not, the alyssum was a beneficial. The marigolds and the beans were reservoirs of mites, and they actually were spider mites and not broad mites, but the Phaceolus will feed on both. Other questions? Appreciate the hearty souls in here. Any other questions? If not, thank you.